Imagine your wedding day, not as a celebration of love, but as a transaction sealed when you were too young to speak your own name. Picture a world where your parents sold you off at 12 to secure a business deal, where your wedding night is a public spectacle with guests watching you climb into bed, and where surviving childbirth feels like defying death itself. Welcome to medieval marriage, where "till death do us part" was less a romantic vow and more a grim prediction. If you think modern dating is tough, try an era where your father could trade you like livestock before you could walk, where pregnancy was a deadly gamble and divorce was as attainable as a flight to the moon. This isn't the sanitized history of courtly love. It's a nightmare of power, profit, and survival that makes even the worst breakup seem like a fairy tale. In the next hour, we'll unravel the brutal reality of medieval marriage, a system where children were pawns, women were property, and love was a luxury no one could afford. Let's begin with a girl whose story exposes the heart of this darkness. Margaret Beaufort, who at the dawn of the Tudor dynasty lived a life that embodied the era's cruelties. The year is 1449, and the stone halls of Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire hum with the clatter of servants and the faint scent of lavender from the gardens below. Margaret, just 6 years old, her golden curls barely brushing her shoulders, is married off to John de la Pole, a boy of 7, in what was essentially a real estate deal. Her guardians, led by the ambitious Duke of Suffolk, saw her not as a child, but as a key to her vast inheritance, lands and titles that could bolster a noble house in a kingdom teetering on the edge of civil war. The chronicler John Harding noted the union with cold brevity. The Beaufort heiress was bound to de la Pole, her wealth the prize. Margaret, too young to grasp the ceremony's weight, likely stood in a miniature silk gown, her tiny hand clasped in another's, the Latin vows a blur above her head. She didn't recognize this marriage as real. How could she, when she was still playing with straw dolls in her mother's chambers? But the adults around her knew exactly what they were doing, securing control of her fortune in a world where wealth was power. 3 years later, when political winds shifted and Suffolk's star fell, the marriage was dissolved like a bad contract, as if it had never happened. The Paston Letters, a vivid record of 15th-century life, describe such annulments as common when alliances soured, noting one case where a young bride was freed from her bond when her lord's fortunes waned. Margaret, now 9, was thrust back into the marriage market, her childhood a casualty of ambition. By 1455, at 12, she was sold again, this time to Edmund Tudor, a man of 24, half-brother to King Henry VI. The chapel at Bletsoe, its air heavy with incense and candle wax, bore witness to a union that defied even medieval norms. Edmund, driven by the promise of Margaret's inheritance, ignored the unspoken rule that consummation should wait until a girl was at least 14. Within months, Margaret was pregnant, her small frame unprepared for the ordeal that would define her life. The Crowland Chronicle hints at the scandal, noting the haste of the Tudor union raised brows, even among those accustomed to such matches. Margaret's story was not unique, but it was a stark example of a system where children were commodities. Across Europe, noble families played the same game. In France, the 6-year-old Isabella of Valois was wed to England's Richard II in 1396. Her trousseau including dolls and miniature silver furniture, a chilling reminder of her youth. The contract, preserved in royal archives, stipulated no consummation until she was 12. Yet the ceremony marked her as property, her childhood traded for peace between nations. These were not love matches gone awry, but calculated deals where daughters were economic assets, their land and titles a winning lottery ticket in a world of wars, plagues, and political upheaval. The Annales of France describe similar unions, noting how noble maids were bound to secure alliances, their youth no barrier to ambition. Medieval parents, operating in a system where a family's fortune could vanish overnight, married off children to lock in wealth and power. The Church, despite rules on consummation ages, rarely intervened when politics were at stake. Papal dispensations, like the one granted for Margaret's first marriage, were issued with a flourish of ink, morality bending to money. This was a world where a girl's innocence was worth less than her inheritance, where the clink of coins drowned out the cries of children like Margaret, standing in cold chapels, their futures bartered before they could understand the cost. The year is 1455, and the damp stone corridors of Bletsoe Castle, scented with rushes and wood smoke, could not shield 12-year-old Margaret Beaufort from the relentless machinery of medieval marriage. Her first union to John de la Pole at 6, a transaction to secure her vast inheritance, had been annulled when political tides turned. But the respite was brief. Now wed to Edmund Tudor, a man twice her age, Margaret faced a fate that defied even the loose moral code of her time. His haste to consummate the marriage, driven by inheritance laws that tied her wealth to a child, left her pregnant, her childhood erased in a single act. The Crowland Chronicle whispers of the unease this caused, noting the Tudors' impatience was remarked upon, even in a court accustomed to such bargains. Margaret's story, though shocking, was not an outlier in the medieval world, where child marriages were a grim currency of power. Across the Channel, in 1396, another child bride, Isabella of Valois, daughter of France's king, was married to Richard II of England at the tender age of 6 years and 5 days. Her trousseau, detailed in French royal records, included dolls and miniature silver furniture, a haunting nod to the childhood she was denied. The wedding contract, preserved in the Annales, stipulated no consummation until her 12th birthday, a rare concession to her youth. Yet the ceremony itself was a public declaration of her status as property. The chapel at Calais, its air thick with incense and the murmur of diplomats, bore witness to a union meant to seal peace between warring nations. Isabella, clutching her dolls, stood as a symbol of France's ambition, her small frame dwarfed by the weight of political expectation. These marriages were not aberrations, but calculated moves in a high-stakes game. Medieval parents, as the Paston letters reveal, treated daughters as economic assets, bare dowries and titles a hedge against the chaos of wars and plagues. The letters describe one family's frantic negotiations to marry off a daughter before a rival claimed her inheritance, noting her worth in land was her worth in life. Across Europe, similar stories unfolded. Catherine of Aragon betrothed at 3 to Arthur Tudor, or Anne of Brittany, promised at 11 to secure Breton independence. These girls were not individuals, but pawns, their futures traded in candlelit halls where ambition trumped humanity. The legal framework, rooted in canon law, permitted such unions. The Church set the minimum marriage age at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, as outlined in Gratian's Decretum, but papal dispensations, like the one for Margaret's first marriage, were easily bought when wealth or politics demanded it. The statutes of the realm show how noble families exploited these loopholes, marrying children to lock in alliances before rivals could pounce. Yet this was a privilege of the elite. peasants and artisans, as historian Barbara Hannawalt notes, typically married in their late teens or early 20s, their simpler lives free from the high-stakes gambles of nobility. For the Margarets and Isabellas, childhood ended the moment their inheritance outweighed their innocence. The emotional toll was profound. Imagine Isabella, 6 years old, standing in a foreign court, her French accent barely formed, surrounded by strangers who saw her as a contract, not a child. Modern psychological insights suggest such early betrothals could instill a lifelong sense of powerlessness, a trauma reflected in Margaret's later obsession with controlling her son Henry's fate, as noted by historian Michael K. Jones. The cultural context amplified the horror. Medieval society, as seen in chronicles like Froissart's, celebrated dynastic unions as triumphs, glossing over the human cost. A surprising parallel comes from Castile, where the 9-year-old Joanna of Castile was betrothed in 1496, her dowry negotiations dragging on for years, as recorded in Spanish archives. These girls, scattered across Europe, were bound by a shared fate, their bodies and futures traded for power. The truly chilling aspect was the social acceptance of these practices among the elite. While the Church preached moral boundaries, its dispensations enabled the powerful to bypass them. The past and letters recount a father's pride in securing a good match for his 10-year-old daughter, oblivious to her fear. This was not cruelty in the eyes of the time, but pragmatism. A family's survival hinged on such deals. Yet even medieval observers occasionally balked. The chronicler Jean Froissart, describing Isabella's wedding, remarked on the tender age of the bride, which stirred pity in some hearts. Pity, though, changed nothing. The system thrived on the commodification of children, and girls like Margaret and Isabella were its currency. As Margaret's belly swelled in 1456, the weight of her pregnancy was not just physical, but a reminder of her place in this brutal economy. The flickering candles in Bletsoe's chapel, where she had been wed, cast shadows that seemed to mock her stolen childhood. Across Europe, other girls faced the same fate, their stories woven into the fabric of a society where power was worth more than innocence, and where the marriage bed was less a promise of love than a ledger of profit. The flickering torches of a medieval wedding feast cast dancing shadows across a great hall, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat, spiced wine, and anticipation. For most, the feast was a moment of revelry, but for the bride, it was the prelude to a ritual so invasive it would make modern intrusion seem tame. In the late medieval world, the wedding night was not a private union, but a public spectacle, a bedding ceremony where the couple's intimacy was scrutinized to seal a contract. For child brides like Margaret Beaufort, wed at 12 to Edmund Tudor in 1455, or Isabella of Valois, married at 6 to Richard II, this ritual was a stark reminder that their bodies were not their own. The Crowland Chronicle describes such events with cold formality. The bride and groom were led to the chamber, their union to be witnessed for the good of the realm. After the feast, the newlyweds were escorted to their bedchamber by a throng of guests, nobles, family, even servants, who saw it as their right to participate. The women stripped the bride, combing her hair and offering whispered advice that ranged from practical to crude, while the men prepared the groom, joking and jostling as they led him to the bed. A priest blessed the marriage bed for fertility, his chants mingling with the clink of goblets and the laughter of onlookers. Then came the stocking throwing, a bizarre custom where bridesmaids and groomsmen hurled stockings at the couple, a direct hit supposedly signaling the thrower's own impending marriage. The Paston letters recount one such event, noting, "The guests made merry with the stockings, though the bride's face was pale as death." For high-stakes unions, like that of Margaret of York to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, in 1468, the bedding ceremony was an elaborate affair. Chronicler Olivier de la Marche described a procession of nobles who ensured the couple was well and truly bedded, their presence a guarantee of the marriage's validity. The pressure was immense. Without consummation, a marriage could be annulled, unraveling political alliances and inheritance rights. In a world where marriage was a legal contract, as detailed in the statutes of the realm, consummation was the seal, and witnesses lingered outside the bed curtains, waiting for proof. For Margaret of York, the chamber was likely adorned with rich tapestries, the air heavy with rosewater. Yet the weight of expectation crushed any pretense of romance. The emotional toll was crushing, especially for child brides. Imagine Isabella of Valois, barely 6, her small hands clutching a doll as she was led to a bedchamber in 1396, surrounded by strangers who saw her as a diplomatic pawn. Modern psychological insights suggest such public rituals could instill lifelong shame, the violation of privacy compounding the trauma of lost childhood. Even for older brides, the ceremony was a humiliation. Margaret of York, at 22, faced a crowd of Burgundian nobles, her every move chronicled for political posterity. The Annales of France note similar ceremonies across Europe, like the 1420 wedding of Catherine of Valois, where guests ensured the union was made fast. Yet the practice wasn't universal. Common folk often had simpler, more private weddings, as historian Barbara Hannawalt observes, with bedding ceremonies reserved for the elite, where stakes were highest. Regional variations existed. Scandinavian laws, as recorded in medieval legal codes, sometimes required public bedding to validate marriages, while in England, Charles I famously barred his chamber door in 1625, rejecting the ritual. But for most of the medieval period, the bedding ceremony was a tool of control, ensuring a woman's body fulfilled its contractual role. A surprising anecdote comes from the 1379 wedding of Richard II's mother, Joan of Kent, where the bedding was so public that chronicler Jean Froissart remarked on the great mirth of the guests, oblivious to the bride's discomfort. The ritual's invasiveness was not just physical, but symbolic, stripping women of agency in a moment meant to be intimate. For child brides like Isabella, the ceremony was a chilling initiation into a life of ownership. Her dolls, a mocking reminder of the childhood left behind. The cultural context amplified the horror. Medieval society, as seen in church records, viewed marriage as a sacred and economic bond, with public validation outweighing personal dignity. The Decretum of Gratian justified such oversight, arguing it protected the sanctity of the union. Yet it left women like Margaret Beaufort exposed, their vulnerability laid bare before a crowd. The emotional weight lingered long after the guests departed. For Margaret, pregnant at 12, the bedding ceremony was a prelude to a trauma that would define her life. The memory of that night in 1455, a shadow in her later years of power. The hall's laughter faded, but the bedchamber's echoes of prayers, stockings, and prying eyes remained, a testament to a system where love was a footnote and control was the text. The winter of 1457 howled outside Pembroke Castle, its icy winds rattling the shutters as 13-year-old Margaret Beaufort lay in a straw-strewn chamber, her screams piercing the stone walls. 7 months pregnant, her small frame was a battleground, her body too young to bear the child, forced upon her by Edmund Tudor, her 24-year-old husband, now dead of plague. The labor, beginning January 28th, was a nightmare of pain and peril, a stark illustration of the deadly stakes of medieval childbirth. Her confessor, Bishop John Fisher, later called it a miracle that a babe could be born of so little a personage, a euphemism for a body so underdeveloped that both mother and child were expected to die. The Crowland Chronicle notes the ordeal with chilling brevity. The Lady Margaret, scarce a maid, brought forth a son at great cost to her life. A birth was so traumatic that, despite marrying twice more, Margaret never conceived again, her 13-year-old body permanently scarred by the ordeal. The baby, Henry, survived to become Henry VII, but the cost to Margaret was a lifetime of infertility and pain, a silent wound beneath her later triumphs. In the medieval world, childbirth was not a blessing, but a roll of the dice, with death a frequent winner. Roughly 1 in 3 women died during or soon after labor, as estimated from church records and chronicles like those of Froissart. The odds were worse than surviving a modern skydive, and for young brides like Margaret, they were grimmer still. Medieval medical practices, as described in texts like Trotula, offered little help. Bloodletting during labor, meant to balance humors, often hastened death, while birthing chairs, designed to force delivery, could tear tissues and cause catastrophic injuries. Wealthy women, with access to midwives and herbal remedies, fared no better than peasants. Isabella of Aragon, wed to Portugal's king, died at 18 in 1498 after days of agonizing labor, her body succumbing despite the best care her status afforded, as recorded in Spanish chronicles. The room where Margaret labored would have been a crucible of fear, the air thick with the scent of burning herbs and the metallic tang of blood. Midwives, their hands rough from countless births, worked frantically, their prayers to Saint Margaret mingling with the girl's cries. Her pelvis, not yet widened by maturity, struggled against the baby's descent, each contraction a threat to her life. Modern medical understanding highlights the risks for girls under 15. Obstructed labor, fistulas, and organ damage were common, as noted in studies of historical childbirth. Margaret's slight frame, described as small and frail, in contemporary accounts, made her survival a defiance of odds. The emotional toll was as brutal as the physical. Imagine a 13-year-old, widowed, alone in a castle far from her mother, facing a pain she could not comprehend. Psychological insights suggest such trauma could forge a lifelong need for control, evident in Margaret's later obsession with her son's safety, as historian Michael K. Jones observes. Across Europe, noblewomen faced similar fates. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a titan of the 12th century, endured 10 pregnancies, each a potential death sentence, as chronicled by William of Tyre. Most noblewomen bore 8 to 15 children, their bodies worn down by relentless expectation. The Paston letters reveal the pressure to produce heirs, with one noblewoman shamed as barren after failing to conceive, despite her husband's likely infertility, a factor medieval medicine ignored, blaming women for all failures. The cultural context was merciless. Producing heirs was a noblewoman's duty, her worth tied to her womb. Failure to deliver, especially male heirs, could mean disgrace or abandonment, as seen in the case of Joan of Navarre, whose childlessness sparked rumors of divine punishment. For young brides like Margaret or Isabella, the cycle began before their bodies were ready, each pregnancy a gamble with death. A surprising parallel comes from 14th century Italy, where the poet Petrarch's daughter died at 17 in childbirth. Her fate lamented in his letters as the curse of her youth. The constant demand for heirs turned women into vessels, their pain dismissed as duty. Margaret's labor, stretching hours or perhaps days, was a microcosm of this brutal system. The midwife's frantic efforts, the flickering candlelight, the prayers for a miracle, all underscored a truth. Childbirth was a battlefield, and young brides were its conscripts. As Margaret clutched her newborn son, the future Henry VII, the relief of survival was tempered by the knowledge that her body had paid a price no child should bear. The castle's stone walls, cold and unyielding, stood witness to a system that valued lineage over life, where a girl's suffering was just collateral in the quest for power. The heavy oak doors of a medieval castle, bolted against the world, offered no protection to a wife trapped within the legal cage of marriage. In the late 15th century, as the medieval period bled into the Renaissance, the law granted husbands near absolute power over their wives, a power that could turn violent, even deadly, with chilling impunity. For women like Margaret Beaufort, who survived a traumatic childbirth at 13, the horrors of marriage extended beyond the wedding night or labor pains into a life where their husbands could legally beat, imprison, or kill them. The doctrine of reasonable chastisement, enshrined in English common law, allowed a husband to discipline his wife with physical force, as long as the stick was no thicker than his thumb, a rule so vague it invited abuse. The statutes of the realm record cases where men were cleared for brutal beatings, their actions deemed lawful as long as the wife survived. But for some, survival was not the outcome. The most infamous example straddles the medieval and early modern worlds: Henry VIII, whose reign exploited these laws to their bloodiest extreme. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn, his second wife, faced the executioner's sword on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, accusations so flimsy that even Henry's own council struggled to uphold them. The letters and papers of Henry VIII reveal a trial rigged for conviction, her supposed crimes a convenient pretext to eliminate a wife who failed to produce a male heir. Anne's real offense was her inability to fulfill the king's dynastic ambitions, a failure that, under medieval law, equated to betrayal. Adultery by a queen was treason, threatening the royal succession, and the penalty was death. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, met a similar fate in 1542, beheaded at around 19 for alleged infidelity. Her youth and inexperience, noted in contemporary accounts like those of chronicler Edward Hall, made her an easy target. Her execution a legal murder cloaked in judicial formality. These were not anomalies, but the system working as designed. Medieval marriage laws, rooted in canon and secular traditions, stripped women of autonomy. As the Decretum of Gratian explains, a married woman had no legal identity separate from her husband. She could not own property, sign contracts, or testify in court without his consent. If he chose to lock her in a tower, as happened to Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, in 1441, it was his right. Eleanor, accused of witchcraft by her husband's enemies, with his tacit approval, was tortured and imprisoned for life. Her story preserved in the Chronicles of London as a warning to women who grew too ambitious. Divorce was a fantasy. The Catholic Church granted annulments only under rare conditions, requiring proof of non-consummation or invalidity, often through humiliating physical inspections. The Paston letters describe one woman's failed annulment bid, her body examined to prove her virginity, a process that took years and cost a fortune. Most women, trapped in abusive marriages, had no escape. The emotional toll was crushing. Imagine Anne Boleyn, once a vibrant courtier, pacing the Tower of London, her fate sealed by a husband who wielded the law like a blade. Modern psychological insights suggest such powerlessness could foster despair or hypervigilance, traits evident in Margaret Beaufort's later obsession with protecting her son, Henry VII, as noted by historian Michael K. Jones. The cultural context reinforced this oppression. Medieval society, as seen in sermons and legal texts, viewed women as extensions of their husbands, their submission a divine mandate. A chilling parallel comes from 14th century France, where Philippa of Hainault endured her husband Edward III's rages, her suffering unrecorded except in fleeting chronicle mentions of the king's displeasure. The law's bias extended beyond royalty. Common women faced similar terrors. Court records from York in the 1400s document husbands acquitted for beating wives to correct disobedience, one case noting a woman's broken ribs as within reason. The system's cruelty lay in its normalcy. Accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or treason could be fabricated to dispose of an inconvenient wife, as seen in the case of Joan of Navarre, accused of sorcery in 1419 to seize her lands. For noblewomen, the stakes were higher, their marriages political linchpins. Anne Boleyn's execution was not just Henry's whim, but a precedent rooted in medieval law, where a wife's failure, real or invented, justified her elimination. The Annales of France recount similar fates, like that of Isabeau of Bavaria, whose rumored infidelity led to her ostracism, her husband's allies turning a blind eye. For women like Catherine Howard, barely out of her teens, the law was a noose, tightened by a society that saw their bodies as tools, not lives. The candlelit chambers where these women lived, their tapestries depicting chivalric ideals, mocked their reality. Every bruise, every locked door, every fabricated charge was a reminder of their powerlessness. A system designed to keep them bound until death, often at their husband's hands, set them free. The medieval world was a graveyard of dreams, where the clink of coins and the toll of church bells marked the rhythm of marriage. A transaction where love was a footnote and death the only certain escape. In the flickering light of a noble woman's chamber, the weight of dowries, the specter of childbirth, and the ever-present threat of a husband's wrath shaped a life where survival was a daily gamble. For women like Margaret Beaufort, whose traumatic childbirth at 13 left her barren, or Anne Boleyn, whose failure to produce a male heir led to her execution, marriage was a brutal economy of power and profit. The Paston Letters lay bare this reality, describing dowries that bankrupted families, with one father lamenting, "Her marriage hath cost us all we own, yet secured naught but her misery." Dowries were not mere gifts, but legalized extortion, often equivalent to $500,000 in modern terms. Isabella d'Este, a titan of the late medieval period, saw her marriage to Francesco Gonzaga in 1490 negotiated over 3 years, her dowry of cash, jewels, and land a fortune that took decades to fulfill. As recorded in Mantuan archives, the bride's family paid not just for a husband, but for protection and status, a desperate bid to climb the social ladder. Yet once married, the bride's dowry, her family's sacrifice, became her husband's property, as dictated by the statutes of the realm. She went from her father's control to her husband's, her worth measured in land and heirs, not humanity. The economic nightmare didn't end there. Inheritance laws ensured wealth stayed in male hands. Widows, like those described in the Crowland Chronicle, often lost everything to their husband's kin, left destitute unless they remarried swiftly. Some, like Margaret Beaufort, gamed this system, amassing wealth through strategic remarriages to Henry Stafford and Thomas Stanley, becoming one of England's richest women by 1509. But she was the exception. Most widows faced a grim choice: remarry or face poverty. The Annals of France recount women marrying 4 or 5 times, not for love, but survival. Each union a roll of the dice in a world where plague, war, or childbirth could end it all. Death was the pulse of medieval marriage. The Black Death, which killed a third of Europe in the 14th century, turned wedding plans to dust, as chronicler John Froissart noted. Families bound by contract were undone by plague ere the vows were spoken. The average marriage lasted 15 to 20 years, not from divorce, but mortality. Women died in childbirth, roughly 1 in 3 per church records, while men fell to war or disease. Remarriage was a necessity, not a choice. Widows wed within weeks, as seen in York court records, where one woman married her third husband days after her second's death, her dowry long spent. Medieval contracts, like those for Eleanor of Aquitaine, included clauses for when, not if, a spouse died, a pragmatism born of constant loss. The psychological toll was immense. Modern trauma studies suggest that living with such uncertainty could foster detachment, a survival mechanism in a world where emotional bonds were risky. The Paston Letters describe a widow's haste to remarry as a cold necessity lest she starve, her grief buried under survival's demands. Children from these serial marriages wove complex family trees, half-siblings, step-siblings, and no guarantee of stability. Church records, like those from Canterbury, read like tangled sagas. John wed Mary, who died in childbed. John then wed Susan, taken by plague. John then wed Margaret, who outlived him. Wedding ceremonies reflected this grim reality, with priests praying not just for fertility, but for the couple's souls, as death loomed closer than love. A surprising case is that of Joan of Kent, whose 1379 remarriage to Richard II's father was overshadowed by prayers for her imminent passing, as noted by Froissart. The constant threat of death made marriage a revolving door, each union a gamble for security in a world that offered none. Yet some women turned this system to their advantage. Margaret Beaufort, surviving her early trauma, became a master of alliances, her wealth and influence shaping the Tudor dynasty. Her story, preserved by her confessor John Fisher, shows a woman who learned to navigate a rigged game, but at the cost of her childhood and health. Most were not so fortunate. The Decretum of Gratian justified this cycle, framing marriage as a divine contract, yet it was a contract that crushed women under its terms. The broader resonance of this system lingers. UNICEF's 2025 data estimates 12 million girls are married before 18 annually, their lives echoing Margaret's in societies where economics still trump humanity. Medieval marriage was not just a union, but a transaction that treated women as currency, their dowries a price paid in blood, their bodies a battlefield for heirs. The candlelit halls, the dowry chests, the wedding vows, all were part of a machine that ground down lives for profit. As we swipe left on modern apps, we stand on the ashes of a system where love was a luxury, death a certainty, and marriage a gamble most women lost. So what do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below so we can chat about it together. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to follow my channel to catch the latest videos.